The future of client management. That's the topic of this latest episode. Hello, I'm Maggie Miller. Joining me today is Senior Analyst at Forrester, Andrew Hewitt. So, welcome, Andrew.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
So, we've seen the market rapidly moving into a convergence where IT operations and security teams need to come together. What are the main benefits of this better collaboration?
So I see four major benefits between this convergence that's happening, both from an organizational perspective, but also from a tooling perspective. And the first thing that really comes to mind when we talk to a lot of our clients about this is really better coordination across both of those groups, and specifically the ability to apply remediation a lot faster when you're driving that level of coordination, whether that's through the tools that the teams are using themselves or through actual just collaboration between the team members. So applying remediation, faster is definitely one of the key benefits. Root cause analysis is another key component of this as well. There are a lot of security events and IT operations events, that are difficult to decipher in terms of what's causing a degradation of experience or a security vulnerability or what have you. And so the ability to coordinate that in a faster manner can lead to discovering that ultimate root cause faster than you previously would have been able to. I would also say that better understanding of how policies from a security perspective impact the user experience is another major benefit of that convergence, right? When you start to understand, oh, perhaps some of these security policies are having a negative impact on things like, resource, consumption or utilization from a PC perspective. That can be a huge, eye-opening thing for an organization to start to realize that some of their security, implications of policies and agents and so forth can actually have a negative effect on the overall user experience. So driving that coordination can enable better visibility into some of those issues. The final thing would, of course, just be, reduce costs. And this especially comes to play when you have a consolidated platform for both security and management over the endpoint. There's been a lot of use cases out there where we've actually seen clients that have moved towards more of a converged endpoint management and security, tooling, platform where they've actually been able to displace third-party tools that might be in their environment. So cost is another benefit that you can sometimes drive depending on the tools that you choose as well.
Where do you see this collaboration happening first? And what are some best practices for making it happen?
So primarily it's happening in what I would call kind of the basic, hygiene areas of IT operations and security. So things like patch management, for instance, become a really good first step for IT operations and security, to work together. In fact, patch management, there's always been some debate as to who actually owns patch management. Is it IT ops or is it security? So it makes sense that they would work together on that. Security operations, for instance, can discover various vulnerabilities or attacks that are happening on the endpoint. IT operations has the mechanisms and processes in place to deploy patches that a lot of times can just fix a lot of those vulnerabilities or prevent, further spread of a particular attack. And so patch management tends to be one of the first places that we start to see a lot of that collaboration. Another very basic area as well is encryption, and particularly enforcing encryption across multiple operating systems. Being able to go out and say, let's have IT ops handle actual encryption across, multiple operating systems that we have and ensure that that's being enforced across the board. Oftentimes there's been some confusion as to who's really responsible for that. It can be a really good first step for security and IT ops to work together specifically on encryption. The last major area that I see a lot of, collaboration happening, particularly as a first step, as you mentioned, is around, CVE and ingestion, directly into an endpoint management tool, being able to pull in those third-party threats that are out there and get all of those alerts is one of the areas that I see in a lot of tools today. We're starting to bring a lot of that visibility to the endpoint management side of the house and give IT ops better visibility in terms of what's happening from a vulnerability perspective. So those three areas around patch management, encryption, and notification around CVE, those are some of the main areas that I see organizations starting along this journey.
Another big challenge for operations leaders today is these endless streams of tickets from multiple legacy management tools.
Yeah.
What are the advantages of adopting a platform approach versus disparate point tools?
It's a great question. And I see this all the time with our clients too, where they have, anywhere upwards of like 4, 5, 6 different management platforms across, multiple operating systems, for example. And so there's a huge benefit of going towards more of a platform approach. And some of the major areas where I see big improvements from both a security and IT ops perspective are one, is something that I mentioned earlier, which is, having multiple OS support and being able to deploy policies across multiple operating systems at once. Encryption is a good example, which I mentioned earlier, but it could apply to other configurations, compliance, components, anything like that, where you can deploy a single policy across multiple different operating systems. That can be a huge advantage from a platform perspective. The other major advantage would be faster remediation. Being able to have that security vulnerability easily tied into my patch management module, for instance, and having those be part of a system that really works well together and is integrated. Oftentimes we see organizations trying to integrate disparate tools through APIs, but they don't get the full functionality of either tool when they're doing that level of integration. And so having something pre-built that's fully integrated to drive that level of coordination from security to IT ops is a huge benefit that can, quickly speed your overall remediation from an endpoint perspective. Another major advantage is that all administrators are going to be looking at the same data set. Traditionally, when we look at our client base, we see all sorts of different technologies for endpoint security, endpoint management, service desk, all these different capabilities, and everybody's looking at their piece of the pie. They're not understanding kind of the holistic nature of what's happening in the endpoint environment. And so when you have more of a platform approach, everybody is standardizing on the same set of data. Everybody knows what's happening from a security perspective, from an ops perspective, from an end user experience perspective, and you can all make choices together and move in the same direction. So it's a big advantage from a strategic perspective of having a platform-enabled approach. Another major piece of this too is policy. So oftentimes I hear from our clients that, there are specific policies from maybe AV or, sort of malware detection that conflict with endpoint management policies that they have in place too. And so there's often a question of what tool takes precedence. When you have a platform approach, you don't necessarily need to worry about any tool taking precedence because it's all a single tool, right? You can define that policy within the overall broader umbrella of the platform rather than having to always keep track of the endpoint management tool is having this particular policy and it has precedence over this policy in the endpoint security tool, right? Not really an issue that people are dealing with. And the final area here, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is around cost and being able to save licensing costs. If you have that platform approach, you can look at displacing third-party tools that might be in your environment and creating a more sort of robust, holistic platform approach that ultimately saves you costs as well.
There has been little change in the unified endpoint management market in recent years. How do you see that category evolving in the future?
It's a really good question. And you're right, there are a lot of market forces that are impacting the unified endpoint management market today. One is that if you think traditionally about the unified endpoint management market, it was about third-party, secure applications, containerization, all of those things that made the initial mobile environment much more secure. You kind of think about that from a segregation of personal and work data perspective, right? That was the initial sort of value proposition. What's happening now is that many of the major operating system vendors are actually building that management and security functionality directly into the OS itself. So that all the UEM tool needs to do is go out and take the APIs from that operating system vendor and integrate them within their overall console. And so what the net effect of that is greater commoditization, right? There's less of a differentiation in the UEM market because so much of the management and security functionality is actually subsumed into the native OS that they're hooking into. And so that is one of the major market forces that's creating some of this stagnancy in the market. We also see that full adoption of UEM is quite low. And when I say full, I mean adoption of UEM across 4 or more operating systems that would be in the environment, right? So it's not often that you would see full adoption across all of the major operating systems. You might have some mobile operating systems, one client managed traditional client operating system, but not kind of the full suite. And so while there definitely have been some examples of companies that have made that full shift to UEM, it is a more difficult journey than I think a lot of folks thought it was initially. And so that's also creating questions of, do I need to have management over all of these operating systems, or can I have specialists on the client side and specialists on the mobile side? And so that's one of the major things that's also contributing to some changes in the UEM market. The final piece of this is also a commercial piece. A lot of organizations are making a move towards larger cloud-based productivity suites where the licensing for basic management is actually included in the overall licensing. So that can actually impact the overall choices that people make from a third-party unified endpoint management perspective. If I have it part of a broader license, I don't necessarily need sort of a third-party tool for every operating system that I have under my umbrella. So with that, we're starting to see a major shift in the unified endpoint management market. And there are essentially 4 major trends that we're seeing UEMs start to differentiate themselves in a world in which there's commoditization of the basic management and security functionality. One area is, like we've mentioned, integration with endpoint security tools and being able to bring in, more of the, endpoint detection and response capabilities, anti-malware, ransomware capabilities, and merge that with endpoint management capabilities as well. Experience management, in other words, understanding what is the experience of the end user when they're using these endpoints, and can UEM start to ingest a lot of the data that's coming from traditional clients to make better decisions when it comes to the user experience, optimize the computing experience, do benchmarking of the overall user experience. And so a lot of unified endpoint management tools today are bringing in that experience management capability as well. Service management is another area too, linking endpoint management with other service management tools. There is the broader enterprise service management market out there today, and we're seeing a lot of unified endpoint management tools start to integrate with those broader platforms to drive remediation, to help with troubleshooting from a help desk perspective, to drive down ticket volumes. All of those are really relevant directions for the unified endpoint management market as well. And finally, there is a push towards increased automation. And this is one of the major pieces of transformation in the unified endpoint management market today. And it's not just automation from kind of a deployment perspective in terms of, pushing devices out to, workers' homes and enable them to log in very quickly and kind of get configured very fast. But it is kind of longer term automation related to self-healing of experience issues or security events, driving, bulk remediation across, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of endpoints, right? And so a lot of organizations are saying, I don't necessarily just want to, manage policy and manage endpoints on a day-to-day basis. I want to heavily automate my fleet so that I can start working on other things that are of priority within the IT organization as well.
One final question before you go. What is one key takeaway about client management you would recommend to organizations today?
So what I would recommend to organizations today is to look at cloud-based client management and specifically look at architectures that are going to help you do patch management faster, help you do policy configuration faster, and also ones that enable you to collect a lot of data. When we talked about automation just a moment ago, one of the things that really drives automation is having all the historical data in place to enable that remediation. So as you think about your endpoint management strategy going forward, I would encourage you to think about 3 major categories. To what degree does the endpoint management tool enable you to make a cloud transformation? To what degree does the endpoint management tool enable you to automate a significant portion of your endpoint management tasks? And what level of data collection is that endpoint management tool taking today to enable that remediation, enable that automation over the long term?
Thank you so much for the insights today, Andrew.
Of course, happy to help.
And thank you all for watching. I'm Maggie Miller, and this is To The Point.